The Rattlesnake's Grin, a tale of dust, deceit, and damned destiny. The sun, a bloodshot eye in the bruised sky, was sinking fast as the bat-wing doors of the Rusty Spur Saloon swung inward, spewing out a gaggle of dust-caked cowboys. They stomped in, boots heavy as anvils, bringing with them the scent of sweat, saddle leather, and the dry, unforgiving desert. The air inside was thick enough to choke a horse. Smoke from cheap cigars curled round the rafters like lazy vipers, and the smell of whiskey, cheap whiskey, the kind that burns going down and bites back coming drup, hung heavy. A gaggle of roughnecks huddled round the bar, their faces etched with the hardship of life on the range. Gus, a grizzled old coot with a face like a dried-up riverbed, held court at the far end. He was spinning yarns about the good old days, back when the West was wild and a man's word was his bond, or his bullet. His cronies, Jake, Tom, and Billy, lapped it up like thirsty pups, their eyes gleaming with a mix of awe and envy. A few paces away, a younger breed of buckaroo was Raisin's hell. Jack, a fresh-faced kid with a Colt strapped low on his hip, was the loudest of the bunch. He was bragging about the latest cattle drive, embellishing the tale with every swig of firewater. His buddies, wide-eyed and eager, hung on his every word. But amidst the laughter and the lies, a shadow fell across the room. The batwing swung open again, and in strode a figure that could have silenced a stampede. He was tall and lean, with eyes as cold and hard as flint. A scar, jagged and cruel, snaked down his left cheek, giving him a permanent sneer. This was Silas Rattlesnake Hayes, a gunslinger with a reputation as deadly as his namesake. A hush fell over the saloon. Even the fiddler in the corner, a scrawny fellow with a mournful tune, seemed to shrink back into the shadows. Hayes moved with the grace of a panther, his hand never straying far from the ivory-handled revolver at his hip. He stopped at the bar, his gaze sweeping over the room like a hawk looking for prey. "Whiskey," he growled, his voice rough as gravel. The bartender, a nervous little man with a handlebar mustache, scurried to fill his order. Hayes tossed it back in one gulp, the amber liquid disappearing down his throat like water in a dry gulch. He slammed the glass down, the sound echoing through the sudden silence. "I'm looking for Gus," he announced, his voice cut in through the tension like a bowie knife. Gus, his weathered face pale, pushed himself away from the bar. "That's me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Hayes grinned, and it wasn't a pretty sight. "You know why I'm here, old man?" Gus swallowed hard. "I reckon I do." Years ago, Gus and Hayes had been partners, riding together, rustling cattle, and living by the gun. But greed had poisoned their bond, leading into a bitter feud that ended with Gus taking off with the spoils of their last heist and leaving Hayes for dead. Now, Hayes was back to settle the score. "You stole from me, Gus," Hayes hissed. "And now, you're gonna pay." Gus knew there was no talking his way out of this. He reached for his own gun, but Hayes was faster. The roar of his revolver shattered the tense silence, and Gus crumpled to the floor, a crimson stain blossoms on his chest. The saloon erupted in chaos. The younger cowboys scattered like spooked rabbits, diving for cover behind tables and chairs. Jake, Tom, and Billy, their faces contorted with rage and grief, drew their own guns and opened fire on Hayes. But Hayes was a ghost in the gun smoke. He moved with uncanny speed, his shots ringing out with deadly accuracy. One by one, Gus's friends fell, their bodies sprawled across the sawdust-covered floor. Jack, huddled behind an overturned table, watched the carnage unfold, his heart pounding like a drum. He'd heard stories about Rattlesnake Hayes, but nothing could have prepared him for the cold-blooded efficiency of the man. As the gun smoke cleared, Hayes stood alone, his gun still smoking in his hand. He surveyed the scene, his eyes glinting with a chilling satisfaction. Then, he holstered his weapon and turned to leave. But before he could reach the door, a voice stopped him. "You ain't getting away with this, Hayes." It was Jack. He stood there, his face pale, but determined, his own gun leveled at the gunslinger's back. Hayes turned slowly, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You wanna die too, kid?" "Maybe," Jack said, his voice steady. "But not before I send you to hell." The two men stood frozen, their eyes locked in a deadly duel of wills. The saloon was silent, the only sound the crackling of the flames in the fireplace and the heavy breathing of the two men. Then, with a speed that defied belief, both guns flashed. Two shots rang out, echoing through the still air. When the smoke cleared, Jack stood alone, his gun still smoking in his hand. Hayes lay sprawled on the floor, a bullet hole in his forehead. The rattlesnake's grin was frozen on his face, a testament to his final, fatal miscalculation. The saloon remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, the survivors began to emerge from their hidden places. They looked at Jack, their eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Jack holstered his gun, his hand trembling slightly. He'd never killed a man before, and the weight of what he'd done settled heavy on his soul. But he knew he'd done what he had to do. He'd brought justice to the Rusty Spur and avenged the death of Gus and his friends. As the news of the shootout spread, Jack's name became a legend. He was the young gun who'd faced down the Rattlesnake and lived to tell the tale. But Jack knew that fame was a fickle mistress. He'd seen firsthand the cost of violence, and he vowed to use his newfound reputation to bring peace to the wild frontier. He rode out of the Rusty Spur that night, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of blood and gold. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never forget the day he stared down the rattlesnake's grin and lived to tell the tale.